listening to TheESP, the European Skeptics Podcast, an independent weekly show set out to bring you news, interesting topics, and interviews with people mostly from Europe, building bridges and breaking down language barriers to show the world how active and awesome the skeptical movement is in the region. This is episode 535. I'm your host, Anders Pinter, and joining me for the show is my co-host, Pontus Böckman. Sia.
Hejsan, Anders! Still traveling, I gather.
Yeah. Still, nobody has ever offered me a job that would allow me to quit this one. So,
oh, well, okay.
I'm afraid I'm stuck with it.
Yes. Suggestions can be sent to info@theesp.eu. If you have a job for Andras, please let us know.
Yes, please. I'm currently in Sicily, actually. In Palermo, just mentioning.
Yeah, very nice.
Palermo.
Nice and warm, is it?
It is incredibly warm.
It's
almost unbearable.
Wow, yeah. Well, I shouldn't and I haven't actually complained about the weather here in Sweden lately. It's been quite pleasant up here. Not dangerously high temperatures as in most of Europe and apparently Sicily. And it's not surprising, of course. Sweden is very far to the north. It should be less warm, but since it hasn't been uncomfortably warm, I have not really realized how warm it actually has been. Let me explain. It turns out that this spring in Sweden has been the warmest spring in Sweden in 160 years since the measurement started. So possibly even longer.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That it's not because 160 years ago it was warmer, but it was probably not measured.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. So I have missed it a little bit because apparently the big changes have been to the north of Sweden. And now, of course, I live in the south of Sweden. But March, April and May saw higher than normal temperatures in many parts of Sweden. The highest temperature of the spring was recorded in Oskarshamn, which reached 28.6 degrees on May the 1st. Pretty comfy, right? Very abnormal for Sweden in May. And for reference, Oskarshamn is about halfway between the south of Sweden, where I am, and Stockholm. But almost 30 degrees there is very unusual. Yeah, anyway, we know the drill. We know what's going on. We know the reasons. We don't have to labor the point. Armageddon is coming. It's not good, but...
we're all going to die.
We're all going to die eventually, yes. So who cares?
Yes. Who cares? It just comes earlier. Whatever. Oh, all right. Speaking of dying, sometimes it's the only thing that we can relate to when it comes to actual dates, about a person that we would like to feature on the first segment of the European Skeptics podcast that we usually have on a weekly basis, and that is TWISH, or This Week in Skeptical History. And yes, when it comes to this guy, we have absolutely no idea when he was born. Well, we do know that he was probably born sometime around 1219, 1220. But we have equally no real clue as to when he died. But there are sources that point to a certain date, and that is the 11th of June, 1294. So hence he's being featured on TWISH.
And who is this mystery man?
This mystery man? He was called Roger Bacon.
Bacon.
Yummy. So he was a 13th century English Franciscan friar, and he's famous for his restless intellect and strong commitment to inquiry that earned him the title Doctor Mirabilis, the wonderful teacher. Although tradition places his death on the 11th of June, 1294, to be honest, modern historians are not entirely convinced that that is the case. So the more frequently used date for his death is not an actual date, it's just sometime around 1292. For a figure associated with critical thinking, he would probably have appreciated that caveat regarding the uncertainty of his death. Yeah. The evidence suggests he likely died around 1292, but whatever the exact date, this week gives us a good opportunity to remember why Roger Bacon remains such an important figure in the history of skepticism and science. So, as I said, he was born around 1220 and educated at Oxford and Paris, which were the great intellectual centers of medieval Europe. He mastered the scholastic learning of his age. Whatever could be learned, he did. But unlike many of his contemporaries, he was not content simply to repeat what authoritative texts said. Instead, he became one of the earliest European advocates of what he called scientia experimentalis.
Oh, I like it.
Because, it basically means experimental science.
I gathered.
Yeah, in a world where Aristotle and other ancient authorities were often treated as virtually unquestionable, Bacon urged people to move forward and beyond that. And he argued that observation, mathematics, and experiment should be the foundations of knowledge and not necessarily just reported thoughts. He insisted that claims should be tested against reality rather than accepted on reputation alone. Isn't that like an amazing skeptical thought?
Sounds like a good
back
idea.
in the 13th century. Yeah. So his most famous work, the Opus Maius, written in 1267 at the request of Pope Clement IV, laid out an ambitious program for educational reform as well, hence the interest of the Pope. But in this book, he explored subjects ranging from optics and mathematics to language studies and experimental investigation of all kinds. And through that work, Bacon returned to a central theme: experience and testing are the only reliable ways to separate truth from error. And that commitment led him into a remarkable range of fields. As I mentioned, he studied optics and explained how lenses function and how light bends. Way before that was done by people like Galileo Galilei or Isaac Newton. So he didn't go into the mathematical detail of all that. He didn't have all the knowledge to use for the explanations, but he discussed it. And he learned Arabic to access scientific texts that were unavailable in Latin, because the Arab world of medieval times was really responsible for saving classical Greek and Latin texts for the future, basically. Actually, sitting here in Palermo, it is fascinating to think about the fact that it was mostly thanks to the Caliphate of Sicily, the center of which was Palermo, current-day Palermo. So it was really an intellectual center of Europe at the beginning of the 11th century. It's really cool. So he investigated astronomy and even alchemy. If you think about the age and the mindset of the age, obviously it would be alchemy that was considered the top of science back then. He even recorded what is generally regarded as the first European description of gunpowder, and speculated about future technologies that sound surprisingly modern, including flying machines and self-propelled vehicles. So
Smartphones?
Smartphones, no, not really. Or at least we don't know. So, not very surprisingly, his views did not always make him popular. He was outspoken, often a bit confrontative, and highly critical of what he regarded as intellectual laziness among scholars. He complained about people who cited authorities without understanding them and warned against accepting arguments merely because they were traditional or widely repeated. Some accounts suggest he spent years under restrictions imposed by his Franciscan order, although the details remain disputed about that. So don't forget that these are medieval events, his whole life, and it's very poorly documented. We should just apply his own skepticism to his own story. But what's striking is how contemporary many of his concerns and thoughts sound. He recognized that language itself could become an obstacle to knowledge, which is why he advocated for better translations and direct engagement with original sources. He argued that scholars should be cautious of errors, misunderstandings, and inherited assumptions that could derail a line of thought. Above all, he believed that certainty should follow evidence, not precede it. And that, I think, is the most important key here. Follow the evidence, not try to adjust the evidence to your already existing convictions.
Yeah.
So he was not a modern skeptic in every respect, but for example, he believed that astrology is real science. He believed that celestial objects could influence earthly events, and his work in alchemy still contained elements that today would be considered mystical to some extent. But don't forget, he was very much a man of the 13th century. So what makes him significant, in my opinion, is that he anticipated modern science very well. It is that he recognized a principle that remains at the heart of skeptical inquiry. When authority and observation conflict, observation must have the final word. So, this week, let's raise a glass to Roger Bacon, whether he died on the 11th of June, 1294, or on any other date. I think he's worth celebrating. And he was a medieval friar who challenged received wisdom, demanded evidence, and encouraged people not simply to believe what they were told, but to go and find out for themselves and follow the evidence.
Very good.
Yes, Roger Bacon. But with that, we are going to move on to much more recent events. So recent that we're about to find out what's been happening lately in Europe.
Yeah, so let's look into scam. And that's scam as in so-called alternative medicine. You know that by now. And you can, of course, do research into scam. And then you could look into that research. You can research the research to see how scientific that research actually is and if there are trends over time. And this is exactly what a study did. It's called Research Integrity and Transparency in CAM Journals. CAM is complementary and alternative medicine. Scam is what we call it and what Ed Soderns call it. But anyway, the title is Research and Integrity and Transparency in CAM Journals. An analysis of publication bias and reporting practices 1995 to 2023 in 4 leading journals. End quote. So it's a long title of that study. And this is a follow-up study of another study that was conducted under Ed Soderns in the early 2000s. The first study compared scam studies in 1995 with studies in the year 2000. So 2 snapshots of 2 different years, comparing them to each other. And this new study followed the same methodology, but looked at the years 2018 and 2023. So what they looked for, if you look at in the written objectives of the study, was, quote, to examine long-term trends in publication practices within leading CAM journals with particular attention to changes in publication types and prevalence of positive versus negative study outcomes as indirect indicators of potential publication bias. So, end quote. The findings were that there is more papers published over time. It continues to increase. The other finding is that a bigger share of these studies are positive in their results. So they seem to show
what a surprise.
that things are working, which we have good reason to doubt. Yeah. The total number of articles in these 4 journals in 1995, in the original study, was 179 studies. And they have gradually increased to 724 articles in 2023 alone. So 4 times as many studies per year now than back in the day.
That's a lot.
At the same time, the share of positive articles have increased from 49% in the old study to 80% in the new study. So more and more research is being done, and the results of these research is getting more and more positive, meaning that they show that whatever scam they look into seem to be effective or work. So that could be a positive thing, really. More and more studies seem to show that these alternative modalities actually are working. So that means that we should use them more, right, Anders?
I believe we should instead apply like a meta-analysis to find out whether that is really the case or there's something else going on.
Yeah, so this is not how we should see it. There's not more better proof that alternative modalities work now. We know from research in serious journals that the better you conduct your studies That is, the more controlled they are, double-blinded and rigorous, the more the positive effects tend to go away. That's just natural. So what's likely happening here is that there is a bias against well-performed studies in these dedicated scam journals, which means that they are not published there. So negative studies tend to be ignored, which we sometimes call the file drawer effect. And that's not a problem only for scam. That's actually for any research. The risk is that if you find that something does not work, it doesn't seem important enough to publish it.
But that is a huge misunderstanding about how science works. But it's very, very frequent. It's unbelievable how many people think that. But a negative result is equally important to a positive result, because you learn something. If there is a negative result, you've learned that there might not be an effect there, or something is off with your study. So that's an important thing to learn as well. It's never, I don't know, it's really concerning that people dismiss negative studies. You don't dismiss negative studies, but the more negative studies any topic provides, the more you're likely to dismiss the actual thing in question. So not the studies themselves, the thing that they study.
Yeah. So there's a problem here. I mean, it's not a good trend. And also the big number of studies, the increased number of studies may also indicate that there's still a big interest in these alternative modalities, which we are very, very confident are mostly bogus. Worst case, the many studies that are published in these scam journals will encourage scam believers to think that there's something in it. But we still have to be on our guard, and of course we will have to keep on explaining why this is not sound and that these alternative modalities probably do not work and why. And the only comfort could be that the negative studies, they may be published in other journals. That was not something they looked into in this study, but it could be. But then we have to point to them and say, hey, we have looked into this. It doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to point out something about this, is that to someone who's a believer in any of the scam modalities, it might look like skeptics requesting sound evidence and a better quality research might sound like moving the goalpost. So like you publish a result and then the skeptics are not happy because they want to see negative results. So they just moving the goalpost to a further point. It's not the case. The goalpost has always been any result that goes through proper experimental protocols. The goalpost has never moved. If something, it's believers in anything who try to move the goalpost closer to them, so that even sloppy science can be used to basically explain what they believe in and to support with some kind of evidence. And that should not be allowed. So as skeptics, we are not married to the idea that these modalities cannot work. But what makes us tick is that these modalities have been shown not to work, and yet they keep experimenting, they keep publishing these results. And as you say, these are increasingly sloppy. That is not a good direction.
Yeah. And there's another aspect of this as well that Ed Sardernst points out when he wrote about these findings, and that is that the low credibility of this research, there's a risk then that we miss if there is actually something that does work. We say, oh, it's all scam, so we were not looking at it even. Yeah. The whole credibility of the field is a danger because we may miss modalities that we thought didn't work, but it turned out there was actually something in it after all.
Yeah. All right. Well, a lot of people think that there is something in whatever religions tell you as well, but it is difficult to find those really well-established claims about Christianity, for example. But according to a new analysis by Humanist UK, the Church of England spent around £35 million last year on projects aimed at evangelizing children and young people through schools and colleges. So, yeah, indoctrination is one way to make people immune to evidence and questioning. So the spending in question is part of the church's broader vision and strategy program, which includes an explicit goal of doubling the number of children and young active disciples by 2030. And the latest review of the church's strategic mission and ministry investment board shows that 6 of the 11 diocesan projects funded in 2025 specifically target schools. These include major initiatives in Rochester, Liverpool, Carlisle, Lichfield, St Albans and Salisbury, ranging from creating new worshipping communities in and around schools to developing what are described as discipleship pathways for pupils. And there is one flagship initiative, which is the Flourish Project, which operates across 12 dioceses and aims to grow young Christian communities through schools and colleges as well. So Humanist UK and the National Secular Society have criticised the programme, and they argue that state-funded schools should educate children rather than serve as recruitment grounds for religious organisations, and I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
The issue is particularly significant because the Church of England operates around 4,700 schools in England alone, educating roughly 1 million pupils, many of whom come from non-religious backgrounds. The reason why these children attend these schools is because that's what they can afford. Sometimes it's cheaper for them to enroll on their program. That is how it works. And I think there is a question of access and consent. So critics argue that some evangelism programs take place during school hours and that parents may not always be fully aware of their conversion-focused objectives. But on the other hand, sending your kid to a religious school, it might be a clue for you that this might happen. So that is something that you should be thinking of. Secondly, there are questions about public funding as well, because church schools receive state support. And that raises concerns about whether taxpayer-funded institutions may indirectly facilitate religious recruitment. And there is the last thing, which is the issue of how these activities are presented. Programs such as Flourish can blur the distinction between religious education and evangelism. Because religious education, it does make sense. Teaching about different beliefs, belief systems, that is something of value, I think, in any society. But evangelism, seeking to persuade children to adopt these beliefs, is a whole different game. I think this level of investments represents a coordinated long-term effort to expand religious influence within the publicly funded education, and that should not be allowed. Secular governance should be the way. Evidence-based education, institutional transparency, and children's right to develop their own beliefs. This is a development worth watching closely. And when we're going in the complete opposite direction, that should be of concern to all of us. But humanist and secular organizations continue to challenge these programs.
Yeah, which they should, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, think if we had £35 million per year to spend on teaching critical thinking and how to spot fake news and how to understand scientific thinking. That would have been a good pot of money.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we don't have that kind of money.
Yeah, we do not. Yeah.
So, okay, let's talk about politics for a while. I know that many skeptics shy away from politics and claim that this is out of bounds for a quote-unquote true skeptic. I disagree. We can't give politicians a free card to do whatever they want to just because they are politicians. Science do have a role in politics, or at least in informing certain policies. Obviously, some part of politics are ideological, and that's fine. That's how it should be. But when policies are being promoted by science-sounding but incorrect statements, then we as skeptics need to call that out, and then we should not be accused of going into politics and outside of our field. It is actually inside of our field, I think. Anyway, so what I want to talk about is that there's an upcoming Swedish general election this year. It will take place on the 13th of September. And the campaigning is already well underway. And more than usual, there are several scandals and even possible corruption affairs in Swedish politics, which I'm not used to seeing like that. The first general orientation for people who are not aware of the Swedish political situation is that there are 8 parties currently with seats in the parliament, which makes it a bit messy. They are, for simplicity, divided into 2 alliances, you can say. The left, which is led by the Social Democrats, but also includes the Left Party, the Greens, and the Center Party. And on the other side, you have the ruling right parties, which are the moderates, the Christian Democrats, and the liberals, whatever is left of the liberals. They are around 2% now in the polls, so they may not even get a seat going forward.
Is that what you need, 2%?
No, you need 4% to get a seat in...
okay. Ooh,
and
okay.
then they're at 2.5%, so it doesn't look very good for them. So, but that's the ruling government, these 3 parties. But they rule only at the mercy of the Sweden Democrats, which is the 8th party. And Sweden Democrats, I've talked about several times, they have their roots in neo-Nazi party sympathies, or in a neo-Nazi party from the 1990s. So you have to be very careful with them. And because of their problematic past, they have not yet been offered a ministerial post. If the right-wing side wins this election, I think they will get a ministerial post. So we will see how that works. But it doesn't look like the sitting government will be re-elected. At the moment, the polls say that the Left Alliance is leading by 10 percentage points. So most experts are saying that it will almost take a miracle for the sitting government to be re-elected. But I talked about scandals, and Sweden Democrats, or SD as they normally called. They have, this week and the last, been implicated in 2 different corruption allegations. The first is that their leader, Jimmy Åkesson, has sold tens of thousands of copies of his self-published book to an SD-affiliated organization, which is partly funded by public means. So he has self-published a book, and then he has let the taxpayers buy tens of thousands of copies of that book. Not very good. Not very good. The second problem that they have now is that it appears that they have done a lot of partying. And I'm not talking about political partying. I mean partying with booze and nice wine and a lot of good food and stuff, also on publicly.
So it's Boris Johnson style? Yeah.
Yes, very much like that, I guess. And they've also tried to cover that up by saying this was an event for this and that, when in many cases it seems that it was just our boy Jimmy wanted to have a good time. They've listed names of people who supposedly attended these events. And these people said, no, I have not been invited to such an event. So why is my name there? Because that's part of the rules for this in Sweden, that if you supply food and have a party and it is sort of a business occasion, you have to list who attended, and then they put in people's names that were not there. The leader of the moderates, who is the current prime minister, his name is Ulf Kristersson. He is entangled in some shady business via his wife, who has had prominent people paying for the privilege to helping out with a certain NGO that she's running. And several of them have later then been awarded, allegedly, fancy appointments because they paid his wife to do work for her for free. And, this is not what I'm used to.
Why?
I mean, this is what we read about in other countries. Sweden is supposed to be this very straightforward and law-abiding country, but apparently not. But it's not only that. We're also on the other side, the Left Party, the former communists. They also have problems. Over the last week or 2, they have had to expel over 20 high-ranking members because these members have publicly supported Hamas and or the terror attack on 7th of October in 2024. That's against the official policy of the party, But apparently there are a lot of sympathizers there for terrorists, and that's not...
That's just one thing that goes against the party's official stance. It's tasteless.
Yeah.
I mean, it's... Why... So supporting a terrorist organization or acts of terrorism, it's just not what humans should do. I mean, no.
Yeah. So, all in all, this is an unusually messy election campaign for Sweden, where corruption and scandals are happening on a level that we in Sweden are not used to. But there is also a skeptical angle to this, of course. I'm not just talking about politicians. If you are a regular listener to the show, you have already heard me talk about the steady decline when it comes to science-based thinking in Swedish policies. And I fully acknowledge that a lot of politics is about ideologies, and that's fine, but some things should be based in science and actually, or in fact, in any case. There is a clear tendency now to misuse scientific appearances more and more in politics. I have mentioned at least 2 cases in the past when the sitting government has told researchers what conclusions they should arrive at. So one is a request to an expert to conduct an investigation to prove how we in Sweden can reduce the number of wolves in Sweden to a certain number without impacting the natural environment. That was the instruction. Prove have we...
And
yeah, they gave him a certain number.
And you did report that?
Yeah, I think the number of wolves they gave him was like 300 or something, which was half of the current population. Say, prove to us that 300 is enough and there will be no problem from an environmental point of view. Okay, that's not how you should do it. I mean, I don't know how many wolves we need, but the government should not tell you what the conclusion should be. And the other thing is, and this I know I talked about in episode 528, it was in April. This was an instruction to an expert to conduct research to prove how you can reduce crime by being tougher on crime, increase the prison time for convicted criminals, and putting 13-year-old children in prison. And again, I'm not an expert on how this works, but then they said, prove to us how crime will be reduced by doing this. And that's not how you should do it. They should say, tell us what we should do to reduce crime. That is the scientific question. And then you can accept the investigation afterwards and see what you do that. If you want to put people in prison just to punish them, that's fine. I mean, I don't agree with that, but if that is the goal, then at least you're honest about it. But don't say it's because you want to reduce crime if you haven't proved that it will actually do so. Well, so anyway, we'll see what's going to happen in September when there's a new election. It looks like there will be a new government in town after that. And to be honest, I wouldn't mind. I'm very uncomfortable with having a government that relies on neo-Nazi sympathizers. But they are still big. I mean, especially in some groups, I saw today that in the group males who are born in Sweden, more than 1 out of 4 is now voting for or rooting for SD, which is a lot. It's a lot. Yeah. Anyway, so we will see what happens. It'll be exciting, and maybe we'll see a change. I hope so, just to be very honest about my political leanings. But at least I hope that we will get a government that respects science. That is the most important part.
Yeah. Well, respecting science and making decisions should be going hand in hand. But making decisions is increasingly based on things like using AI. Back in the UK now, where there was a new report that is raising concerns about the legal and ethical risks of using artificial intelligence in healthcare. And this report comes from the Medical Protection Society, which is the organization that provides like insurance cover for doctors. And it warns that NHS clinicians could face legal action if AI-driven diagnostic or decision support systems make mistakes that harm patients. And as AI tools become increasingly embedded in clinical decision-making as well as in many other decision-making processes, A fundamental question is raised here, and unfortunately it remains unresolved. And that is, when an AI system misdiagnoses a patient or recommends an inappropriate treatment, who is responsible for that? Is it the doctor who followed the advice, the hospital that deployed the system, or the company that built it? And according to the Medical Protection Society, current UK law offers no clear answer to that. Doctors remain professionally accountable for patient outcomes, yet many may not have the technical expertise to fully evaluate whether an AI recommendation is reliable. At the same time, they can be influenced by algorithms whose internal reasoning may be difficult to audit and even a little bit non-transparent or just opaque. The report also highlights that there is a growing gap between the rapid rollout of AI technologies that we see all over the place and the much slower development of legal and regulatory frameworks. There is another aspect of this, because the technology is developing so fast that we cannot actually keep up with the legal environment. And everything should be existing in a legal environment where we know what the legal status of anything is. And that requires work. That requires deliberation, consideration, and deep thought before we can manage that. But we don't have the time to do that because the technological development is so fast. It's really an interesting and very concerning problem, actually. AI definitely has the potential to improve efficiency and support clinical decisions. But the Medical Protection Society stresses that its limitations must be clearly understood as well. But that requires a certain amount of deliberation as well. So it seems like an impossible mission. So what are the main concerns that are identified here? One of them is biased training data, which exists in the whole of science as well. And the whole question of using AI, that what is it trained on? There might be the problem with the lack of transparency in how systems reach conclusions. Because it's for many of us, it's basically a black box. You don't know how it works. You don't know why it comes to a certain conclusion. And there is another thing that is closer to actual everyday clinical practice, and that is the risk that clinicians under intense workload and under a lot of pressure that comes with that may become overly reliant on automated outputs. And the report also points out that there is a need for robust testing across diverse patient populations and transparent performance data before these tools are widely trusted. And the MPS is urging the UK government to provide urgent regulatory clarity, establish explicit guidelines on liability, and ensure clinicians receive appropriate training to use AI safely and critically before adoption spreads further. I think that is a really important issue that we have to tackle.
Yeah, you got into this, but I was thinking that, my gut reaction is that, of course, a doctor needs to know the limitations of the tool that he's using. But what if the efficiency demands on the hospitals are so high that there's no time to double check? You have to rely on the AI response, because otherwise you could have done the job without AI, and that's not efficient either. So it's a dilemma. I don't know how to do that, and people need to. Smarter people than me have to look into this and decide who is responsible.
Yeah, but I think that is the key here. So politicians, well, with rare exceptions, don't necessarily like to discuss these topics with smarter people. So they make the rules, they make the law without having a clue. First of all, this is why we need more science-minded and science-educated people in politics. That is one thing. Or we need those in politics who are happy to ask for expert opinions before making a decision. That's what should drive these decisions. But unfortunately, it's not what we see in our everyday lives.
I always think when we talk about politicians, and I criticized politicians just now in this episode, but we have to remember we get the politicians that we deserve in a way. If we want better politicians, we have to vote for them. And if we want people to vote for sensible politicians, we need to educate them. So it's actually not the politicians that is the problem. The problem is that the general public does not understand science well enough to vote for the right people. That's my opinion.
True that. I agree with that completely. Okay, but, well, we have been discussing a couple of things that can go wrong, but let's find out who's been really wrong lately in Europe.
So I don't know why this week's recipient has not received a really wrong award before. He should really have had that a long time ago. Tommy Robinson is a far-right activist and conspiracy theorist provocateur who for several years have made a name for himself as an anti-immigrant Islamophobic nutjob, in my opinion. His merits include being a member of the British National Party, which was, I guess, a British fascist political party. Maybe they're still around. He was the joint vice chairman of the British Freedom Party, and he helped to develop the UK chapter of the now defunct Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the West, end quote, abbreviated PEGIDA. He has a history of criminal convictions, including for crimes such as assault, threats, harassment and fraud, as well as contempt of court rulings relating to his videos, and he has served 5 prison terms between 2005 and 2025. He has also been an advisor to UKIP, and after a Syrian refugee boy was assaulted in a school bullying incident in October 2018, Robinson falsely accused the victim to having previously attacked 2 schoolgirls, which was not true. It was, many of people will have read about this before. Now, many of us have heard also about the terrible stabbing attack in Belfast in Northern Ireland this Monday on the 8th of June. For reasons that are still not clear or investigated fully, a man called Stephen Ogilvie was assaulted by a man who stabbed him with a knife several times. From what I gather, Ogilvie lost an eye in the attack, and some sources say he is also in a coma. I'm not quite sure about that, but anyway, it's a horrible attack on one person there. But Tommy Robinson, cheered on by Elon Musk, no less, posted messages online to fuel the current violence in Belfast. And that's because the alleged perpetrator is a man of a certain skin color. You can guess which one. Obviously, no one thinks this horrible knife attack is acceptable, but to encourage people to set cars on fire and run amok on the streets, destroying property and terrifying innocent people just because you are a xenophobe is horrible. Robinson is clearly exploiting the situation to advance his own agenda, even as the relatives of the victim have publicly asked people not to commit violence. And they have declared that many migrants make a valuable contribution to the UK. So they say, don't make this about migration. Don't use our tragedy to commit these crimes.
That's such a huge high level of humanity and clear thinking for the victim's family to be able to come out and publicly say that. I really admire that.
That's really commendable. Very good. But Tommy Robinson, on the other hand, he gets this week's award for being really and terribly wrong.
Yes, and shouldn't fucking keep doing that. Because that's one thing that you're wrong, but having such a great effect makes you responsible for things. And I wish there was a way to actually make that happen, to make him take the responsibility in some way. Okay, thank you very much for that, Pontus.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of this week's episode. But the conclusion of the episode requires a quote. This week, I brought a quote from the aforementioned Roger Bacon. And the quote is, "The strongest argument proves nothing so long as the conclusions are not verified by experience. Experimental science is the queen of sciences and the goal of all speculation."
Wow. That is pretty advanced for being from the 13th century.
13th century. Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Well done.
All right. But that really concludes this week's episode. So thank you very much for your continued efforts, Pontus.
Thanks a lot.
Many, many thanks to our listeners as well for tuning in. Please keep doing so. And until next week, goodbye.
Hej då!
Visland.
This has been your ESP experience. The show is produced and recorded by TheESP.eu. Join us again next time, but until then, please send your feedback and comments to info@TheESP.eu. We would also love to hear your ideas and suggestions regarding topics, and if you have any skeptical news from any European country, we're always eager to hear about them. If you have an upcoming local event or an organization to promote, please don't hesitate to let us know, as we are more than happy to help. All music in the program was written and performed by Keisha J. Gray and George Robb and is used with their permission. Please check out our webpage for show notes and archive material at theesp.eu. Follow us on Blue Sky at theesp.bsky.social. Like us on Facebook or support our work on patreon.com/theesp. And don't forget to spread the word by sharing our content with others.
I don't know how you can believe.
Has spent around 35 million. Spent around 35 million years. 35 million years. But the conclusion of the episode cannot be final and. The strongest argument proves nothing. Okay. The strongest argument proved nothings. Fuck me. Many thanks to our listeners as well for tuning up. Please keep.